I just want to welcome you to the Tree Actions podcast, where tree people talk about their reactions to growing up in the human forest. And I've started thinking about,
Sure.
the human forest as something we all live in. And, I think trees are really amazing examples of how, kind of how to live almost. And, you're already talking about it. I've, I've, I've had only recently, I was talking to a friend who's in Portugal, and she was trying to understand exactly what arboriculture is or an arborist does. And, you know, it, it, it always comes down to I said, it's really like being a doctor kind of, because every tree's different. Even if, it doesn't matter if it's plant healthcare or if it's a removal, there's nuances and things you gotta figure out along the way. Certain things about species and stuff are similar, but I've yet to meet a tree that isn't different than the other, even though they're the same species. And so you know, you have such a rich past, Don. We're so excited to have you. Uh, I know that we very likely are going to end up having to do a sequel or another, because I don't know that we're going to have time to get to all the possible things we could talk about. But maybe, how do how did, uh, well, you know what? I'm going to, your background goes back so far. How do you feel trees have, you know, affected you in your life in general?
Well, I don't know what I'd do without them. I'd have to be working in a coal mine or something. And even coal comes from trees.
Right.
But, having grown up in the profession, uh, I think it helps to put my life in context by honoring my father a little bit. He was born in Minnesota in 1893. He went to the University of Minnesota at the St. Paul campus, which was the agricultural school, and said, I'd like to learn to be an arborist. And they didn't have, and he probably called it tree
Right.
surgeon back then, but they didn't have a specific course. But they said, we can take care of you. They had him take botany, entomology, and plant pathology. He had to take blacksmithing to make some tools and hardware that
Wow.
didn't exist, so he could do some cabling and some cavity work. He trimmed these huge elm trees on campus for credit. So he went to college in 1911, and uh, I don't I don't know when he graduated, but he went basically right into World War I. And his MOS was the Chemical Warfare Service, so poison gas was his job. And he said he thought that he might learn something about pest control. What he learned was that mustard gas is not very good for clients' oak worms, so we had to use other things. But he got back out to California a few years after the war and started the MF Blair Tree Experts in 1922. So that's the world I grew up in. And ever the professional, my dad founded the California Arborists Association, which started out as the Bay County Tree Surgeons and Pest Control Operators Association. Now try and put that on a letterhead. So it wasn't too long after that they changed it to the California Arborists Association.
Right.
But he was instrumental in drawing the arborists in the San Francisco Bay Area together. And they met monthly and would have speakers, and they would discuss what the upcoming problems were. And the industry was changing so much at the time that I'm sure they were talking about what spray chemicals and things like that were available to solve certain problems. Pest control was so primitive in his early days that they didn't even have a spray oil. they used to use ammonia to break motor oil down to an emulsifiable spreader. And then a fellow named Volk, Volck, developed Volk spray oil. And that's from that point on in the mid-20s, they had that to work with instead of, I'm sure they talked about what ammonia and what motor oil did the best job.
So would that be the precursor to dormant oil, Don?
And yes, that, and also using it on scale, treating. We used oil a lot with scale, and it would be used with Bordeaux mix and some other things. So he founded the California Arborists, and then not too long after that, he published Practical Tree Surgery, which was unique in that it dealt with the insects and diseases and conditions of trees on the West Coast, where Perrone dealt with the East Coast. So his book was used as a standard text in the schools that taught forestry and arboriculture related topics up and down the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. And then they preceded the Western chapter of the ISA, and the CAA was always smaller, but they provided a lot of leadership to the Western chapter. So their Western chapter this year is going to be celebrating their 80th anniversary.
Yeah. And it's a pretty vibrant chapter to this day. So where did the, was it you that started into the more of the manufacturing side of things? Or your dad obviously was a blacksmith. He built stuff too. So that's in your blood as far as designing and building things?
Yes, but he, the sort of things that he innovated for our tree work was the spray rigs. He worked with some engineers to create spray rigs that had two tanks, and you could pump out of one or the other. And before he came along with that innovation, all the spray rigs were one tank, and you sprayed that out, and then you had to wait for it to fill. And then if you were changing chemicals, you might even have to flush the tank and the hoses. So he had one machine that was two 200-gallon tanks, and you could pump from one to the other. And the very first one he did was on a 41 Dodge truck chassis, which he bought in 1946 or 7. It was basically surplus from World War II. And that one had two 400-gallon tanks. And he called one of the tanks a nurse tank because they could pump that tank into the one that they could spray out of. So they had one 400-gallon tank that they could use to put out the chemicals, and then they could pump that other 400-gallon tank into it and keep going. So that was the first innovation. Then the second one was they got more sophisticated with their plumbing, and the one I used, I could pump out of one or the other. His brush truck, because we're talking about before chippers, had the most unusual dump mechanism I've ever seen in my life. It was a hand crank winch made by Ramsey. And he had seen an awful lot of his competitors and friends with busted hydraulic hoses and things that just weren't working. And in all the years we used that truck, it never once failed us. But it was a hand crank cable lifting mechanism that would raise the dump bed up about that high. and it just absolutely never failed. He could also unhook the cable, run it through a pulley that they had mounted flush with the bed, and they could either with a ramp or tilt the bed some, they could use it to winch logs onto the truck. Now, I never worked with that aspect of it, but I know that they had that option, and I'm sure they did before my time.
Interesting.
But I saw that we were using the same tools in 1967 that my dad was using 50 years earlier. And I just thought that maybe things could be better, but I didn't start to really get to work on making things until 1975. And that's when I founded the Sierra Moreno Mercantile.
And what do you think was your, or some of your crowning achievements in developing with Sierra Moreno?
Well, tree saddles for one. I was the very first to put out a wide back saddle, and they're all wide backs now. I was the first one to do a modular system to where you could change the lower assembly. You could mix and match sizes if you were in between something, and we're still doing that. I worked with Ed Hobbs. Ed invented the original lowering device, but he was interested in doing the work, and he didn't have time to market, so he built them and I sold them. It was a perfect relationship, and I'll have to take credit for making Ed's invention pretty famous. And then once I bought the patent rights to it, I was able to put more improvements into it, and then Ken Johnson came along with his patent on an angled frame, and we put the two of them together, and we've got a pretty darn good machine now. But lots of little things. Believe it or not, I invented the cammed lanyard adjuster. I saw somebody using a micro adjuster from Rock Exotica, but it had a spring-loaded pin to release the cam. And I could just see some bored guy up in a tree going, I wonder what this pin does, and pulling on it and falling out of the tree. So I thought that it would be better to have a bolt. I also wanted to see how strong it was. So I took it to Bashland, and we drop tested it, and it blew apart at around 3,800 pounds, which is probably strong enough. But the 5,000 is the magic number. So I flew out to Utah and met with Rock and showed him what I wanted. And he was doing CNC machining then, and this was in the 80s, that he was able to make a lanyard adjuster that met all the right specifications. And since then, it's been copied by everybody. Some good, some not so good. I made fiberglass pruning tools popular on the West Coast. Before, we used wood poles and, believe it or not, aluminum.
Right.
You just had to make sure you weren't near any power lines with an aluminum pole saw.
For sure. Wow. I remember my first what I would consider modern rail harness was where did stringer fit into that, Don? Because I remember my harness said.
Stringer was the manufacturer.
Okay. Yeah, because it had
stringer.
stringer on the back, but it was a Sierra Moreno harness or saddle, but okay.
Well, Dwayne, I could dream them up.
Okay.
I couldn't make them. So after the St. Louis ISA meeting in 76, and that was where we had the very first Tree Trimmers Jamboree for the ISA. And I was there. And I had a friend on the other side of Missouri, near Kansas City, who was going to be moving back to California, and she needed some help. And I had already had contact with The Stringer Company, which was also Utilities Safety Supply out of Lee Summit, Missouri, which is a suburb of Kansas City. And I'd called her up to see if she'd like to come to the banquet. And I didn't really look at a map, so I didn't realize she was way the hell on the complete other side of Missouri. So she said that wasn't going to be practical. And that's when I found out she was moving. So I said, well, look, if I fly into Kansas City, can you pick me up there? She said, sure. So she did. And she took me to Utility Safety Supply, which was owned by Freeman Stringer and his son, Dean. And Dean's original background had been jazz music. He taught jazz at San Jose State University, California. But as his dad got older, then he needed help. And I met Freeman in the last couple of years of his life, and Dean took over the business. So the two of them were the same entity under the same roof. You had Stringer and Utility Safety Supply. They made the Brooks Climber. They bought the rights to the original Brooks Climber, and they were manufacturing them. But he had an employee named Dolores. Well, we'll go with that for now. Dolores Parker. She made every saddle and lineman's belt that the company sold over a 55-year period. She made every belt that we ever sold. And I could come to her and with my hands say, I want it to look like this and I want it to do that.
Yeah.
And she could do it. She hit it out of the park every time I brought her an idea. So we started with the what I called the utility saddle because it was for utility tree service, separate leg straps, floating D, and a 3-inch wide back because that was the standard, 3 inches. And they ate it up because that replaced a rope-strung saddle. And then I brought out one that was a seat saddle with a floating D. And, of course, a standard butt strap saddle with two separated Ds that came together, the kind that a lot of people like to spreader snap on. And we went from 3-inch to 4-inch. And one of my employees had been a lineman for Pacific Gas and Electric. And he said, hey, Don, I really liked the wide back on the lineman's belts. Is there any way you could do that on a saddle? So I flew back to Kansas City and met with Dolores, and we came up with the modular idea. And that was the genesis of what we're still doing. I listened to people who tell me what they wanted, and if it was possible to do, we'd figure out a way to get it done.
Hey, Don, where do you think as far, I know recently you just spoke on the history of climbing, and I was fascinated by that, and I'm really curious. I know that that's a whole topic in and of itself, but like even I remember the floating D ring, where I could, where it would slide along the bridge, if you will. That was pretty innovative. Was that already in existence, or was that part of that whole process? And then, the evolution now into, you talk about a rope harness, and now we've got some of the most popular harnesses actually having a rope as a bridge.
Yeah. There's nothing new. There's nothing new. My first saddle, which is in England right now, I'm going to have to get Jeremy Barrell to send it back. It was all hand spliced out of 3/4 inch manila, and the fellow that made it was the type that could take and do a splice. He could bring two ends together and splice it up so that you couldn't tell where it started. It was just a beautiful butt splice. And it had separate leg straps and a rope floating bridge. And it was all made from one length of rope. It was all made from one piece of rope. And there was a snap that was either livestock or horse or something like that. But instead of an eye that was the same thickness as the body of the snap, which is what most of them are, this one had a big thimble forged right into it that was about
I've seen those. Yeah,
that wide, and the rope ran through it, and that was a very popular homemade design. I don't even know how far back it goes, but I was in Germany in 2018, and I brought that with me because Mark Bridge wanted me to speak specifically to my contributions to the evolution of tree saddles, and I wanted to be able to show where it started from. So I brought that, and I said, "You guys all think that a rope bridge saddle is something new? Here's one that's 80 years old." And a couple of fellows came up to me after I spoke and said, "Boy, you sure have one dealer who's upset. He's been bragging to everybody for a few years now that he invented the rope bridge saddle." So we all went and gave him a bunch of shit over not having invented it. And I don't like them, and I've seen enough videos on YouTube, Facebook and YouTube to kind of justify my concern. I call it the frayed shoelace, where some in the earliest days of the American-made ones, there were some splices failing, but everybody's had a frayed shoelace, and you look at it in the morning, you go, I really should replace this, but it didn't break yet. And you might go a long time with that frayed shoelace before it finally breaks. That's human nature. The bridge that we use, and with the most popular design, the separate leg straps and we added 2 floating Ds, so you could use a split tail with it, or have a double crotch. It didn't cost much more to add 2 D rings while we're at it. But from one end to the other, from the left leg strap right through the bridge to the end of the right leg strap, that's all one piece of webbing. When it gets to the bridge, it's doubled, and then it's put inside that tubular webbing. So the tubular webbing is a chafing sleeve, which completely eliminates any wear at all on the structural component. So we've been able to eliminate the frayed shoelace. And in all these years and all these thousands of saddles, I've only seen one where somebody had worn it down enough to where they cut it off and didn't use the black chafing sleeve. But I was fascinated to inspect the bridge, and there wasn't a single stitch broken. I said, "How long ago did you do this?" And he said, "About 5 years ago." And he said, "I got this from you 30 years ago." And he said, "I was thinking maybe it's time to replace it." So he did.
Yeah, I got mine.
Have you ever heard of the geezer's climb? Well, he was on his way to the geezer climb, and he wasn't sure that belt would pass inspection, so he thought he'd bring a new one.
Yeah, that'd be a good place to go, Tony, for some face-to-face. We should make a cameo appearance to the geezers.
It is funny how like innovations like that rope bridge saddle, they get introduced, and then it somehow the original intent of it gets lost, because I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a saddle and everything from competitions to just working on it, and you ask, "Hey, what's the best advantage of having a rope bridge saddle on your saddle?" And they're like, "Oh, you can replace it so easy." And then you look at it, go, "When was the last time you replaced it?" And they're like, "Oh no." I'm like, I look at that thing like you should never look at the bridge of your saddle and go, Like the moment you go, it's time. It's like, it's absolutely time. Like right then. And it's like, and you know, those things you can change them. So there's 2 ways to go around it, right? You either do what you just described, which is essentially a bridge that's about indestructible under normal operation, or you change that rope bridge constantly. right? You change it constantly. And I think where a lot of guys and girls that are climbing miss the boat is they replace it with whatever they have on hand, right? And it might not be the best material. Yeah, and it's probably the worst material ever, which is a strong argument for a harness that has a bridge that is just, it's there and it's not going anywhere. And it'll be good till you retire the saddle because you want a different color one.
Well, that's an interesting point.
One of my concerns too about the rope bridge, as opposed to the way we do it, is I've always wanted my center of gravity to be in close. So the bridge is close in. And I see these rope bridges, like they come up past your chest. And it's got to be very easy to flip upside down if you lose your balance. And I've seen that on Facebook to where they're showing off and doing it on purpose, or doing a backflip out of the tree because they can do it. But I'm not an acrobat. I'm an arborist who climb. The reason why I climb trees is that's where the work is. I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't do it for the thrill. I do it because that's what I do for a living. And if I'm going to do tree work, I got to get in the tree.
Yeah. What is it, do you think, about, you both have made reference to it as far as this, I don't know if it's safe to call it a culture, but, we wear a chain. It's common in the industry, from trucks to chainsaw pants, like to harnesses to rope. Like, just when it gets comfortable, it's probably time to replace it. And that's just when you start really liking it and use it well past. And I'm guilty of it myself. Like, I've been guilty of it. Like, what is it? Is that, what is it about the industry that's sort of like that? I'm curious what your thoughts would be on that. Or do you know what I mean?
It's called, I know exactly what you mean, and that's called human nature. That's not because of being an arborist. That's because of being a human. Sometimes it's because they're cheap.
Yeah.
I paid, and the other thing I can't believe is how expensive some of these saddles cost and how quickly they wear out. To this day, our modular saddles are $337, and they last longer and, in my opinion, work better than $600 and $700 saddles. And I come from, I just turned 70 on January 11th.
That's awesome.
So I come from 2 generations back from these guys. And you go back a long ways, Dwayne, and I don't know you as well, Tony, but if you've been at it for more than 20 years, a lot of the stuff that we've got now wasn't even a twinkle in somebody's eye. And I can't believe the amount of stuff that people carry up a tree. They've been doing this now ever since the Sherrill catalog came out. But I've always told people, as a head judge of the event formerly known as the Tree Trimmers Jamboree, that I don't care how much you bring to the job. You drive a 2-ton truck. But I'm more impressed if you come up with a work plan and you only take what you need and you use what you take. I've seen a number of people carrying so much stuff. I've said, can I ask you a question without insulting you? Do you work alone? And are you clumsy? And they're looking at me. So why would you ask that? And I said, you've got 3 and 4 of the same damn beaner. If you worked with somebody on the ground and you dropped it, they could tie it back on for you. But since there's nobody on the ground, if you're working alone, you don't want to go back down to the ground and pick it up and go back up again. So you must be carrying spares.
Yeah.
And they generally the joke goes over their heads because they take shit seriously.
Yeah, that's probably. Yeah. Oh yeah.
But you've seen it, right?
Yeah,
you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I think, and there's also a bit of a prevailing attitude, especially among climbers, where somehow if it's newer, it's better, whether it's better or not, and that somehow more is more. So if you can make it more complex, it's somehow much be better. And it's not true across the board. I think what happens is guys and girls get into the field and they're excited by the technicality of it and all the gear and the shininess, and the good ones get past that and then carry up in the tree what they want. And
I agree with you 100%. The other thing that our colleague in common, John Ball, is finding is he's starting to take surveys when he gives talks. He's probably still the busiest man on the circuit. He says, how many of you are using akimbos and zigzags and whatever else, and how many are using a Blake's hitch? And he says 80 to 90% of the people that he polls every time all over the country, they're still climbing on Blake's hitches. And he said, I'm beginning to get concerned that the ISA is catering to a very small elite percentage of people and ignoring how the work is really being done. And I'm inclined to agree with that, because all the three of us need it, and all the three of us would need today would be a climbing line of suitable length. I like steel snaps because when you go to throw a flip line around, it's got a little extra weight to it. And I used to climb some really big trees, and one of the best things about a shot pouch is if you put it on that snap, when you've got to throw 8 and 10 feet around a trunk, it helps it go even further. But all we need is a good lanyard and a climbing line, a couple of snaps, and a handsaw and a chainsaw, hard hat, safety glasses, appropriate hearing protection, and you can get an awful lot of work done. And you can get up there a whole lot quicker than somebody that can't figure out which mechanical friction thing they want to use. And I discovered Facebook over Thanksgiving. I'd ignored it studiously, and now I fell down the rabbit hole, and it's hard to climb out sometimes. I didn't realize that there were so many special interest groups that interest me. Chainsaw collectors. And then you've got you've got home light chainsaw collectors as a Facebook group. Yeah. You've got McCullough. Yeah. And then you've got, they'll get anything they can get their hands on. I collect military vehicles, so it's kind of nice to know about that group. But there is an abundance of tree-related Facebook pages. And they all call themselves, like, when somebody calls themselves a tree bastards, that tells me that they don't have a whole lot of pride in what they do. Another one is tree tards. That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in their sense of professionalism. But, there's a tree climbers one, and there's a whole culture of climbers that I've had no contact with. And I think a lot of these guys they allude to being drug addicts, and I wouldn't be surprised. The contract climber, which we had our own employees. And if we needed more help, we would team up with another complete tree company. Sam Noonan and I did an awful lot of great jobs together. And when the big job was done, we went our separate ways. But these guys apparently work out of a van, and for ridiculous amounts of money, they go from one job site to another. And anybody that's showing a fan of $100 bills and bragging about, well, that's what I got for today's work. Wonder where the meth dealer is. Right. It's a culture that I don't understand it. But they are addicted to the newest and the shiniest, and they make fun of people that are using a Blake's hitch. Yeah. So it's an interesting divide.
You know what's interesting, Don?
That if it weren't for Facebook, I would.
Well, you know what's interesting, and you're touched on some pretty relevant things that we deal with within our training company. And, you know, we just recently had an event, and Tony's part of our organization, but, uh, you know, it's so easy these days to have a voice or to say what you want to say or to hold a fan of hundreds out, and so many people can see it, you know. And I don't know that what we see so readily available online, whether it be Facebook or Instagram and all the rest, is necessarily a strong representation of really what's going on out there. You know, I think it's a small percentage of the actual people actually doing the work. They don't have time for Facebook or Instagram. They're not on there. They're not doing that. And the ones that are the ones that, you know, for one reason or another, I think some of them are actually interested in trying to teach people things or show people new things, or it's just a they're interested in not just arboriculture but the technology of sharing what they're learning, you know. And it's really hard to sift through that and to decipher what's what, you know. uh it and it's so easy to put yourself out there, so to speak. But I would agree with the yeah.
I couldn't
And the
agree
working
more.
arborist, you know, I mean, I've had my heyday with Facebook. I have an account and I used it. I used it a lot more than I think I should have, and I've had to go through like a kind of had to wean myself off, so to speak, and use it more responsibly. Yeah, exactly.
Detox.
But it's you know, I think everyone has to. But if I was in production tree work, I don't know how active I would be on it. I don't know, Tony. What do you? I got to. He touches on some pretty modern things there that are
Yeah,
part of our culture now as well.
it's. I have a lot of mixed feelings as a trainer around the whole social media thing because, and Dwayne, you and I have had this conversation when, and Don, you've probably experienced it too. When you step into a room to do a talk or a training course, there's YouTube, the silent partners there, because people will literally look up what you're talking about, and if they find a contrary opinion on Facebook, they'll or you know YouTube, they'll throw it in your face, regardless of where it came from. And you know, it's like everything seems if it's the old if it was in the newspaper it must be true, and that used to be at least it was verifiable. Now if it's on YouTube it must be true.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And even worse than that, John Ball has told me he's had this experience several times to where he's on a program and he sits in on the program coming up before him. So he's in the room and somebody has filmed his talk somewhere else at some other time on a phone, and they're presenting it as their material.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even give him credit for stealing it. And that just goes too far. And he says he's sick to death of people coming up saying, that was a great presentation. Do you mind if will you give me the stick so I don't have to do all this on my own? And no, I absolutely agree with that totally, especially what you were saying, Dwayne, about the small percentage of squeaky wheels. But it's been very instructive to me to see the number of failures. And I get a huge kick out of watching tree work in the third world, where you've got somebody barefoot without anything. Maybe he'll throw a short rope around a trunk and hold onto it with one hand. Well, he uses a Homelite XL12 you know, to dismantle something that's 90 feet in the air. But it's almost like there's a script that the gang that we're talking about, every last video that I've seen is almost to the same specification. Up 50, 60, 70 feet. You got a GoPro on your helmet, and you're on 6 or 8 inch diameter wood, and you're piecing that one out. Big deal. That's not what impresses me. And yet that's what they continue. I've seen it maybe 100 times. I could care less about what you're doing where the wood is small. Show me what you can do with bigger wood. But everyone seems to be, well, I can show how high up I am. Big deal. The other thing is, You almost never see anybody who's not wearing spurs. Yeah. They almost all of them on Facebook wear spurs. And most of them are showing off removals. And if you go to, I think it's called Tree Climbers, there's a fellow that is very honest and open about his injury. And it is something that you'll never forget. He got spiked in the groin by another climber. He was teaching he was teaching a man how to use spurs, and he had come down out of the tree, and they were on the ground together. And this guy that got hurt's like the foreman or the trainer, and the tree starts to go the wrong way. Well, they're both backing up, watching as they're backing up. Well, the fellow that got hurt tripped over a chainsaw that was, behind him. He tripped over the saw, so he fell. The other guy tripped over him and jammed a 2 3/4 inch spur right in his groin, as high up as you can go, and nicked his femoral artery. Said it took the paramedics 2 hours, or doctors 2 hours, to stop the bleeding. And he showed pictures of the wound, and it's a gigantic 3-corner tear, just like what you'd see if you were to spike in a tree into deep bark. And he's battling he's trying to avoid sepsis now with antibiotics. He's still in the hospital. It's just a hideous wound, but it's something that makes one heck of a learning experience. But there's so many people wearing spurs in all these videos, and I'm good on them, but I made more money without them. I did better work without them because we were pruning trees. The trees that my dad had worked in 50 years before I was in them. So it was, I'm not impressed with people that do nothing but work off of spurs. They're not arborists.
Well, certainly with as far as pruning goes, absolutely. It's another tool, right? Like it's interesting you talk about spurs because they just so happened the company that I learned and first started working at, they were very, they had the guy that started the division was just in love with Shigo, and I guess fair to call him a Shigoite. And he just said spurs hurt trees, and we just didn't have them. I'd worked 2 or 3 years, and I went to another company, and they couldn't believe that I had never seen a set of spurs. I'd never, for removals, anything. We just simply didn't have them. So I consider myself quite lucky because I never learned to climb on spurs ever. It was something I learned much later, like 3 years into my career, first I ever put a set on. And I could see their advantages, but I still found I felt more comfortable without them, even in a removal.
Well, I'm with you. I'm with you. And we used to joke about having to detox climbers that came from other companies. And we joked about having rubber gaffs on a set of spurs so that they'd feel comfortable with the iron, but they had rubber spikes so they couldn't hurt anything. We joked a lot about that. We never did it, but I did. One fellow said, "Can't I wear spurs?" And I said, "Yeah, if you take the gaffs off, you can wear the iron. That's fine, but you'd be better off to learn how to work without them."
Well, one thing I was curious about, Don, is the transition from I guess what we started slang calling the split tail, like that, like how exactly, like that it seems to me that was kind of the start of the climbing revolution, if you will. When that innovation, when we took the tail off that bowline or clovitch or whatever you were using and tied it separately. Like it seems like a lot changed in that time period. The pulley under the knot, then the rope changing to being a shorter rope and an I, and all of that. Is that, like, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, as far as, because it seems like to me before that there was innovation, but it was not to the massive degree that it is now.
Well, you're absolutely right, um, and we'll get to why I think there's so much innovation now. But the first time I saw a a split tail system was in Australia in
Okay.
1986, and they used a an
Yeah.
endless loop, 3-strand, to
Yeah.
tie a prusik into their climbing line, and then they clipped that to their saddle. So that was the genesis of it, and it was I can't remember if they called it a closed type of system or an open system, but it was something that had come to
Right.
Australia from England, because a lot of the climbers in Australia, even to this day, they come over from England. They either went through Maristwood College or one of the other one of the other schools that teach arboriculture, and they have their licenses. And being in Canada, it's pretty easy to move through the
Right.
Commonwealths as opposed to an American. But Ken Johnson was the very first climber that I knew on the West Coast, which was California, to take and cut his Blake's hitch free from his climbing line. So that, because before we left, maybe a
Yeah.
5 or 6 foot tail, it took your climbing line, tied a bowline into your snap, and then left a 5 or 6 foot tail. We always tied a figure 8
Yeah.
in the middle, in between the climbing line, between the snap and where we'd tie a hitch. And then you tied your hitch, and then you put a figure 8 in the tail of that. And on a manila rope, the taut line hitch worked great. It was good for 100 years. But when the braided ropes in particular came out,
Yeah.
it would creep, and you had to put a figure 8 in there, or you'd find it coming apart on
Yeah.
a long rappel down. And that's when the Blake's hitch came along, and believe it or not, I named it.
Okay.
Jason Blake called me, and it was early 80s, mid 80s. Jason Blake called me, and he said, Don, I've come up with this climbing hitch, which works well with braided ropes, and I'd like to make a video. It'll be about 8 or 10 minutes, and I want to get $40 for it. How many do you think I can sell? And I said, you'd be lucky to sell 3. One on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and one in Kansas City. Because the word will get out like wildfire. I said, if I were you, I'd go for fame, not fortune, because you're not going to make any fortune. And I said, what do you call this thing? And he said, the slip or slide knot. But he said, if you tie it wrong, it's the suicide knot. And I said, well, that's all very cute. But if I were you, I'd call it Blake's hitch.
Yeah.
That'll make you famous. That'll outlive you. And that's how it got the name Blake's hitch.
And I don't know if you remember, Don, I was,
And it was just
getting back to your comment earlier about nothing is new. I was doing a seminar in Vancouver Island. It would have been in the late 90s, I guess. It would have been around, I would have say, wait a minute. Yeah, no, that's, or what is it? It might have been early 2000s. Anyway, a guy came. He was an older gentleman. He'd been in the business a long time. And he specifically said, I want to learn this new hitch. I want to learn the Blake's hitch. And I said, okay, no problem. I said, well, why don't you tie me what you're using just to see what he was on. I'm assuming he's going to tie a taut line. And he ties a Blake's hitch. And, I kind of chuckled at him. I said, well, someone already told you or showed you. And he said, no, this is what I've been climbing on for 30 years. He'd been climbing on it since the 70s. And I was like, how the heck? Because everywhere I went, it was something new. It was Blake's hitch, right? And here it is. And it wasn't a joke. He'd been using it. So there he is showing me the exact same hitch. And so clearly, um, it's interesting. I have a theory, and I'm guessing this might take us down a bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it's worth going. And I'm really curious of your thoughts on this. You know, it seems to me that the history of climbing and arboriculture must have its roots in shipbuilding, going all the way back to the people that built the boats. Because where did they get that wood for the masts? And then not only that, the rigging of the boat, you got to climb up and down and move sideways along like to rig a galleon and to build a galleon. You had to be a tree guy to get the wood in there somehow, or there must have been some connection because it was rope. So surely they didn't just drop the log that they built the mast out of on the ground. They must have done some lowering and then lifting them in place and installing them and then rigging the sails. Like they had to have been using all manner of hitches and finding ones that slid the best and moved the best. And is that like, have you ever heard any connection to that at all?
Absolutely. Have you ever heard of the
Yes, sir.
Ashley Book of
You bet.
Knots? Well, look at all of the different knots that are in there and hitches and splices
Yeah.
that Clifford Ashley documented. And he had them documented by profession. And the other one is the Rigger's
Yes.
Apprentice. Now, the interesting thing, my connection to the Rigger's Apprentice is the artist that drew the pictures, Robert Shutterly. I bought the Rigger's Apprentice about the time I was thinking about writing arborist equipment, and I was so impressed with the illustrations. I said, you know what? I'd like to have somebody like this guy draw these pictures. And I said, well, why not get a hold of him? So I did, and I happened to catch him in between projects, and he did all of the illustrations in arborist equipment. And the reason why he was so good at drawing ropes and the detailed in fiber, he was an Audubon illustrator. He could draw feathers with a pencil. And he came down from Maine and spent a few days here in Hagerstown at the farm. And to look over his shoulder and watch him with a blank sheet of white paper and a pencil and create a vision was just incredible. I admire other people's talents because my talents are limited. They're good at what I do, but I'm not much of a musician and I can't draw a straight line without a ruler. So I admire that kind of skill. But to go back to your question, your statement there, everything evolves, and when the Crown was staking out the original 13 colonies, one of the first things they did was send their master shipwrights here to go from Maine to the Carolinas to survey the forests and the trees, and they marked off huge tracts of trees, the live oaks, the Virginianas, with their branches that had huge buttresses in them, made perfect knees and ribs for the ships. The white pines of Maine made the masts. The turpentine that they could get out of the pines in the south. All of that was as important to the military in the 16 and 1700s as nuclear power is now. So that was just essential to keeping the British Navy on the water. The Spanish used everything they had to invade England with the Spanish Armada. They used up the last of their good trees for making an armada, and when it failed, when the armada was hit with a storm and they went up on the rocks and they sank, that was the end of Spain as a sea power. They'd used up the trees. They couldn't rebuild. And these are really fascinating little bits of history. It could well be that your man there on that island had tried to tie a taut
Yep,
line hitch
absolutely.
years ago and got it wrong and came up with Blake's hitch purely by accident. I don't believe that Jason invented a knot that had never been used before. Obviously he hadn't, but he
Right.
rediscovered something
Right.
that had been forgotten
Yeah.
in our profession. So I'll give him
Oh, yeah.
credit for discovering it, but he didn't invent it. It just got
Yeah.
rediscovered.
Well, and this guy told me that steeplejack, older steeplejack, showed him the knot, the hitch.
That
Yeah,
makes all the sense
that's
in the
where
world.
and
That
he
makes all the sense in the world. And in Ashley's
yeah, and
book,
he called it. He said he was told it was called a painter's hitch.
that's probably what it was. Remember when Ron Denise was running around
Yeah,
as the
yeah, yeah.
master rigger, and fortunately his flame burned out quick, but he was teaching what he called
Correct.
a Stilson hitch. Well,
Yes, it
it's
is.
a cow hitch. I found
right.
it in Ashley's. And I said, where did you come up with Stilson? He goes, well, the guy that taught it to me, his name was Stilson. So I called it Stilson's hitch. And that's how knots and hitches got their names. But there was already a name, the cow hitch. And I made darn sure that the industry knew what the real name was. I said, if it's in Ashley and it's got a name, that's what we're going to use, because then you have a reference. If you forget how to do it, there, because if you go looking for Stilson's hitch, you're not going to find
it. No, I agree. That's a pretty. It's still, I think, Tony, we pretty much consider it the gold standard.
Oh yeah, the Ashley Book of Knots is that reference to Bible of Knots. Don, you said something earlier about why we have so much innovation today, and I'd love to get the answer to that question, but I'll give you my answer. I don't know about today, but I know, just so you understand, like, I'm second generation arborist as well. My father came from a forestry background. At age 30, he took a job in arboriculture, 1970, because that's where the money was. So I grew up with it as well. But I never wanted to be an arborist. I actively tried not to be an arborist. But when I did fall back in the industry, as so many do, I got in right on that cusp of, split tail just coming on, Blake's hitch. So I've seen a lot of the innovation. And all those innovations, like when we went to split tail from before, it solved the problem. And then we put that micro pulley hitch beneath it, and that solved us a problem. And everything we did solved a problem, and that was the driver of innovation. And now I see all these things coming out, and they're innovative and they're different, but they seem to be variations on a theme, and they're not solving problems anymore. So I'm wondering the value of it. But I'd love to hear your take on why there seems this huge explosion today.
Right.
Well, since I go back a little further to when an innovation was learning how to tie a new knot or a hitch that you hadn't used before, there was no innovation in the equipment. All of the innovation came from individuals. Ed Hobbs developed and patented the Brightan tree saddle. Nobody else had ever had one that had suspenders and an articulating leg strap system that he was able to patent. He invented the lowering device. His inspiration there was he went out on a job, and one of his guys, they were taking down a pine tree, and at about 3 feet off the ground, there'd been a branch on the pine that came out parallel to the ground, at a right angle to the trunk. It was about 5-6 inches in diameter, and he'd cut it off and left a stub 2 feet long. They were taking wraps on it. They were taking wraps on that stub, and the light bulb went on in Ed Hobbs's head. And just like Ken Johnson, Ed could see the need. He could figure out what he wanted to make, and then he had the skills to make it. He did the welding, and then he went to a foundry to have the spool cast. And so all of the innovation had to come from individuals. For one reason, the industries out there didn't pay any attention to arborists. We were an unknown quantity, and while they were beginning to pour money and innovation into high angle rescue and mountaineering and that sort of thing. That's where the figure eights came from. That's where the carabiners come from. All of a sudden, when the CNC machine came along, that a lot of this stuff is now possible. Before, you could dream it up, but there was no way to make it, especially on an assembly line basis. But Rock Thompson was one of the pioneers in using CNC to make his special equipment, the micro senders and the macro senders and all those ascenders, the casing, the shell of it, that's all machined out of a billet of aluminum on a CNC machine. And before that, the technology didn't exist. The Gibbs Ascender has been out longer. It's the predecessor of anything from Rock Exotica. And if you look at the body of it, it's a piece of sheet stainless steel that was formed. It was flat, and a press pushed down on a mold and turned it into a U and put whatever else needed into it. They could press it, but being able to CNC machine things with a computer program, that just opened up a world of possibility that we didn't have any access to. If we couldn't weld it or forge it or cast it, we couldn't make it. But now we have this advantage of this technology, which didn't exist before. And that came along at about the same time that there were new innovators coming into arborist equipment, like myself, saying a micro sender, going, you know what, that'd make a great lanyard adjuster, but we need to make it a lanyard adjuster. And then I'll give Toby Sherrill a lot of credit for following along and taking things that I was doing, to the next level. But without the manufacturing ability, then you can dream up all you want, but if it can't be made, you're not going to have it. So I think it's a combination of the idea and the ability coming together, so that now we've got things that were unimaginable before because they couldn't be made.
And so that's why we're seeing just so many, we may have thought of variations to, like, I think of a mechanical hitch as a big example. You go back to, Hubert Kowaleski with ART, the founder of that company, kind of really pioneering the mechanical hitch concept. And, I think his designs were CNC as well. And, and now it's an interesting way to look at it. Like, the easier it is, maybe 3D printing we'll see another jump, potentially.
Well, what I see is again, on Facebook just recently, I saw a fellow that had just come from the Geyser event in Florida the week before. And I think it was an akimbo that he was showing, but there's a cam at the top of the body of this thing that's supposed to be spring loaded so that it moves easily. And he was showing that his was frozen, that it wouldn't move, which meant that it wouldn't perform the way it should. And he said, well, this thing's 3 or 4 years old. It's time to retire it. Mm-hmm. Fact is, it's past time. And that's the thing with the discipline of replacing, equipment. When I was in Germany, there was a person that worked for ISA there who told me that she looked forward to the day that we were no longer allowed to use knots in our work, that she wanted to see everything mechanical. And I looked at her and I said, I hope to God I don't live long enough to see that.
Definitely lose something.
Yeah.
And we haven't had much to say to each other since, but I just don't believe it. I think that you take all this stuff that this youngest generation is addicted to and put it in a 5-gallon bucket, hand them a rope and say, go to work. They're going to be blowing bubbles. They won't know what to do. I think that anybody that's going to be taught how to climb, I firmly believe that it should be in a protocol for training, that they learn how to climb. If you want to call it old school, fine, but learn to climb with a rope and a Blake's hitch, and even to use a Beckett bend on a wire core flip line instead of having a lanyard adjuster. Because if you boil the work down to the simplest common denominator, a rope and a flip line, then it doesn't. Then they can build on that. They can use anything in that 5-gallon bucket.
Yeah.
But they can always go back to those original skills. But if you take somebody in off the street and you tell them that the only way they can climb is with a bucket full of stuff, and you take that bucket away from them, they're staying on the ground.
How do you integrate that with, because that's very much a moving rope type configuration and setup. What we're seeing now is a lot of climbers, I shouldn't say a lot, but the newest generation where they don't even know moving rope. They only know the single or stationary rope technique. Yeah, the
SRT.
stationary rope technique. What, there's literally climbers, and I don't know. Again, I may be talking about the small percentile, but they don't know how to climb in a moving rope at all. So, and they argue that, well, I know how to do this. I throw the rope over, I tie it off on the bottom, I make sure it holds good, and away I go. And the efficiency that it offers them, particularly in ascent. It seems like there's a lot of sacrifice made for being able to get up easier, which, let's face it, has always been a challenge. I mean, let's go straight back to good old-fashioned footlock, and in its earliest conception, it was to get up there, because that's the hard part. Coming down's easy. We all know that. You can come down pretty fast if you want to, but nobody can get up as fast as you can come down. So it's that
right,
exactly,
especially if you fall.
So it seems to be this marriage between what's easy to work the tree and also what gets you up there easily and efficiently. Where do you think the whole SRT movement is going to fit in and shake down in the industry? Because it seems like it's here to stay.
Well, and I don't have a problem with it. I don't personally. I have not climbed on SRT except when Tom Ness took me to Kings Canyon, and we climbed a gigantic sequoia, about 25 foot in diameter. And he used a bow and arrow to get a line up into the tree, and then we got a bigger rope in it. And then I used ascenders, and it was the type that you had to bring your knees up. You had to bring your knees up to your chest and then stand up and go up like an inchworm. And that was before you've got them now that attach to your ankle and that sort of thing. There's certainly a place for both, but when I see some of the trees that these guys are putting 3 different ropes in, and they got a mechanical, ascender on each one, a mechanical friction thing on each one. They're hanging up there like a spider, when all they needed was a climbing line on a double rope setup. You spend an awful lot of time stringing all that stuff. And I know that's coming from an old guy, because my dad never used a rope to climb with. He shinned everything. And he used to complain about, by the time that guy gets his rope in the tree, I could be done with it. So by the time that guy gets his SRT set up, I could be in and done. I just don't think that it's wise for us to turn our back on the classic skills just because they're classic. I don't think so. And I also think that nobody should be stuck with one style of climbing. If I was younger, I'd want to know more about SRT, but I've seen enough to where I know darn well that I wouldn't be comfortable with the concept. I'm so used to coming down on a, on a double rope on a Blake's hitch that when I want to move, I'm going. And it must take some getting used to be working off of a fixed line, a single line. It must take some real getting used to if you've been climbing a different way for 60 years. I certainly have
found it myself, and I haven't done as much of it. I don't teach as much climbing anymore and so on. Like Tony, you've worked right through that transition, though.
Yeah, I think the goal as a trainer is to have your students. There's principles and things, and there's methods, right? And the methods there's millions of methods, but the principles for all those methods remain relatively small and consistent. And it doesn't matter, the way a tree is loaded, whether it be an SRS system or an MRS system, is still load, and how that works. So if you can start to teach people to understand those principles, and then they can apply those principles and choose methods, then I think you're getting somewhere. Because I agree with Don, the SRS, it's a tool to be used. But if your only tool is a screwdriver, you're going to run out of things you can open up pretty quickly. So you have to have a varied toolbox. And for me as a climber, coming into it, a little more modern, I guess you say, I came in, I think, what I consider a great time, because it was just new enough that I don't think you'd consider me old school, but I'm just old enough that you certainly wouldn't consider me new school. So I have a blending of both. For me, it's like, does it solve a problem? Because ultimately I'm climbing that tree to prune it. I'm not pruning it because I happen to be climbing around in it. So if it's a tool or technique that helps me get out there and make a proper cut, I'm all for it. All right. If it doesn't, then I'm just not interested. If it's just another piece of gear or another rope, then I'm not interested in that. So if it's helping me do my job, if it's helping me get out there, and basically my job is caring for that tree, then I'm all for it. If it's just another way to go about it, or if it violates the principles, if it's just not structurally sound, I'm just not interested in it. So,
well, one of the things that concerns me is, again, tools are great. It's knowing when to use a particular tool in a specific application. And the big shot has certainly allowed people to put ropes consistently up a whole lot higher than they could get with a hand-thrown throw line. And the problem is you can put a line in the tree a lot higher than you can possibly judge how strong that branch is. And Ball has been proving that having two guys pull on the rope does not double load the rope. It's not an accurate indication of what kind of load it can take. And in some cases, it's actually weakened the branch just enough to drop somebody when they get 30 feet up. The other thing is, if you remember, all of the standard protocol for tying in was you didn't put your rope on the branch. You came around the tree so that if that branch broke, with any luck, you're going to slide down the branch, the trunk, until you hit another branch. Now, you might end up on the ground, but you didn't do this. And with SRT, that's what they're doing consistently every day, because they can't get the rope around the trunk. I don't know how many of them go up to where the rope is crotched and then redo it. But this new system is climbing diametrically opposed to what we taught for 100 years. And it was taught for a darn good reason. It's safer. The other thing that I see is, well, John's been taking these surveys, I almost forgot one. He asks how many people are using ladders to get in the trees, not to work off of,
Right.
to get in the tree. And again, it's the same percentage of people using Blake's hitches. Can be
Right.
most of the room. And we've kind of lost sight of that in the real world. You just don't see the new generation even considering using a 36-foot extension ladder to get into a tree, and then you have it removed. You don't
Right.
work off of it. But I can tell you that that's the fastest way to get into a lot of trees. I've got a maple in the backyard here that has so many branches that trying to get a throw line over a really good branch, you're going to take a lot of throws. Throw that 36-foot ladder up there and you're in the tree. You can tie in, and from that point on, you can move around. And I think that there are times when that ladder is a tool that is the best choice, and it's not being recognized necessarily by enough people. We did an awful lot of entry using a ladder, and even after I learned how to footlock, and the tree trimmers jamboree is what saved the footlock, I think, from extinction. That brought it back, and I did a lot of footlocking, especially into redwoods and firs, where one time I got a line on the first branch was 80 feet up. I footlocked up 80 feet. And then what I did was I took my flip line, threw that around the branch and clipped in. So I wasn't going to fall while I'm trying to belly over the branch because I didn't have anything else to hold on to. But that's still a really valid tool that I think is being forgotten.
Yeah. Or the technique has been variated to use, equipment that maybe isn't as hard on the joints. That's one of the things you hear about, particularly with traditional footlock. It definitely takes a toll on the hips and knees and ankles.
Yeah, we hear that all the time, but nobody ever backs it up with any research, right? Like, it's like when you think about it for a footlocking, like how often what is the percentage of your climb that you're actually footlocking, right? It's just, now, if you're footlocking 3,000 feet a day, you're probably going to have some ergonomic issues, no doubt about it, right? But if you walk that far, you're going to have ergonomic issues. So I think sometimes these things get, arguments are made that aren't based on any type of evidence or science. It's like, well, we have to use ascenders to do this type of ascent because footlocking is bad because of the asymmetrical rotation of your hips. No one's ever quite proved that. Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you're going to footlock 3,000 feet, yes. But I mean, think, from a climbing standpoint, if you climb vertically, up and down, working a tree, say 700 feet a day, how much of that's a footlock? 60, 70 feet of it. It's not, it's all in dose, right? But Don, I wanted to know, as a man that has innovated things and has brought products into the industry, right, for arboriculture to improve things, where do you think, if you had to invent something today, like the XYZ climbing device, and it's the best thing ever, how would you go about it today? Because there seems to be this influx of, DIY, do-it-yourself tools coming in. And I'm not agreeing with the way they're bringing it to the industry, the way they're doing it. I would be curious, if you were going to innovate something today, how would you do it?
That's a good question. I suppose I'd have to look back at what caused me to innovate something 50 years ago. And it was recognizing a need or an opportunity to make things better. I started innovating equipment for my own tree company, and other people saw it, and they said, man, that's cool. I'd like one too. And then some of the things we were doing with the lowering device were such that it was rigging of a type that they had no experience with, so they wanted me to bring a lowering device out to them and show them how to use it. So then all of a sudden we're doing rigging workshops. It was all by demand. I didn't create the need. I responded to the to the need or to the request. So I was innovating equipment at the same time I was traveling around the world showing stuff off purely on request. I was the first one to make fiberglass pruning tools popular. I thought it was better than an aluminum pole. And the way that came about was in 1975, I went to Western Chapter meeting in Palm Springs, and there was a fellow there. He was Dick Alvarez's brother-in-law, named Charlie. No, it was his brother. It was Charlie Alvarez. That was Dick's brother. And he had put together Arbor Supply. So he was the supply side of Arbor Tree Surgery. And he was selling Marvin pruner heads on a fiberglass pole. And the fiberglass pole was actually a pole vaulting pole. It was lighter than anything I'd seen before. And I had never seen a Marvin head. What was standard on the West Coast from one end to the other was the Porter pruner. And we didn't like them, so we didn't use them. We had them on the truck, but it was like, oh, God, we got to use the Porter. It was heavy, and it didn't make that clean a cut. But when I saw the Marvin pruner on a fiberglass pole, I was the Eskimo that saw a refrigerator for the first time. I said, man, this is cool. So I asked him how much they were, and he said they were, I think, $50. But if I buy 10 of them, he'd make me a dealer. I said, well, hell, I only need one, but I'll take 10 to save a few bucks. So when he dropped them off, as coincidence would be, that night, we were going to a California Arborist Association dinner, and I tied one to the side of my dad's car and took it into it was a dinner meeting, and I took it into the dinner meeting and I showed it around. I sold 20 of them that night. And the guys are saying, are you going to get into selling equipment? That'd be great. I need 100 lags. Another guy wanted 5 gallons of tree paint. The Shigo hadn't been out there yet. And somebody else wanted a 600-foot coil of rope. And I said, well, hold it. I don't even know if I can get this stuff. But give me a little time, and I'll get back with you if I can. And the opportunity in Northern California was absolutely wide open. Everybody that I called wanted to do business with me because they didn't have anybody doing much in the Bay Area. Except Coomerling, he was reluctant. He says, I don't know if I want to supply a competitor. And I said, well, that's your decision, but all I want to do is buy tree paint pots, because Coomerling made the best tree paint pots back then. And it went from there. But to get back to your original question, there's so much that has been done now. I'd have to really get into it to sift through and see if there's some loopholes or some gaps that haven't been addressed. I'll tell you what really impresses me is the newest generation of electric chainsaws. Mm-hmm. I bought the Husky i540T, and I am absolutely impressed with it. I waited until they'd been through enough evolution to where I'm really in favor of that saw. And I've told people, and I've said, look, I don't get paid to sell Husqvarna's products. I don't get a commission on anything. I'm just telling you that from my experience, I think this is a great saw. And climbing with it, it made me aware of things I hadn't even thought about. If you're tied in an awkward position and you've got a saw that's been a little cranky and you're trying to pull start it and it won't go, you just wear yourself out. But to turn it on and just pull that trigger and have it cutting, that's beautiful. The other thing is I stopped burning my hip on the muffler. I think the best climbing saw, one of the best in history, especially in its era, was the Poland 25. But the muffler sits proud of the body of the saw, and it seemed like it was always turning. So as soon as the saw got hot, it turned to where the muffler was branding your leg. One of my climbers had a leather patch sewn to every one of his pants, right where the muffler would ride on him. So it didn't bother him anymore. Right. He solved the problem. So you don't have the muffler problem. I never was bothered too much by gasoline fumes, but you don't have them anymore. And they developed a chain, I think they call it the nano chain, specifically for that saw. It's narrower, which means a smaller curve. That saw cuts smoother and holds an edge longer than any chain I have ever worked with. And I go all the way back to really old home lights. So I think right now, I think that's the best climbing saw out there. And the balance is perfect. It's right on the trigger, but I don't for a minute use a saw one-handed. That's not how I judge them. Right. But I do like the balance, because 5 years ago, well, it's been more than that now, coming up on 9, at the 2013 Expo, that was the 75th anniversary of the National Arborist Association, and I worked on putting a museum thing together, but still had their first generation of electric climbing saw. And it was so back heavy that you literally had to force the saw down to get it to cut. Its natural balance was like this, and you had to literally force the bar down to the wood. And I said, I don't forget it. I don't care if it even cuts good. I didn't like the balance. Yeah. So they've come a long way. And the battery's about the same as a tank of gas.
It's quite astonishing. They are an amazing innovation. Like I said earlier when we started, Don, I think that there's no question we need to schedule you for another chat. No, this is our longest podcast so far. And there's no reason that we have to stop. I don't want to necessarily say I'm doing that, but I want to at least capture one last thing. And you mentioned about the one-handing, that you wouldn't for 1 minute judge a saw on its one-handed use. It's as trainers, obviously, it's a pet peeve. Oh, I think it's more than that. We think it's a major safety concern. And certainly, what you hear out there is that, that's the way you do it in training. But then there's, when you get in the real world, here's how it's done. And how do you address that with people? Is there a way that you dispel that, or how do you explain why it just isn't right to one hand a saw? Like safety, how do you explain that or address that?
Well, I've seen too much. If you're working with one hand, the temptation then is to start cutting above your shoulders, above your head. And I don't care how strong you are. If the saw kicks back, you can't stop it. It's coming back at you. And I know too many people that look like they were in a bar fight with a broken bottle. And I don't know the man, but one of my climbers worked with this fellow who had this one, I don't think he was using it one-handed, but the saw kicked back and plunged bored his chest. It went right through his ribs, and it just barely missed his heart. And he said he was in the ambulance, and he heard the EMS saying, "We're losing him." Wow. And they came that close. The other thing is the temptation. You're up there in that scenario I told you about. You're up 60 feet and 8 inches of wood, and you got your GoPro on your head, and you're cutting with here, and you're reaching over the bar to push that piece over. It's just now you're in position for it to kick back. And I don't care if you've been doing it for 20 years and never had an incident. What are you going to do when it does happen?
Exactly.
If you can train people just to not even get in the habit. And I made that comment on purpose because I've had to detox myself from the temptation, because there were times when it just seemed to make sense. I'm out on the end of a limb and I want to cut something out beyond me. So I'm holding on with my left hand to my Blake's hitch, and I lean out and I make a right angle cut. Well, I've never been concerned about a kickback. If it kicks back, it's not going to hit me. And I used to use that as an argument for not completely banning one-handed use. But if you get somebody in the habit of that, then they'll start to backslide a little bit. They say, well, that's okay. Then I can do it for this reason or that reason. And we've got to take a stand somewhere. And it's important. When the Z133 committee tackled the no one-handed use, Mark Chisholm's father, his hair was on fire, and he denounced the concept. He said, we won't be able to get any work done. And since then he has mellowed on it. But something like that was challenging the older guys. And some of them just don't want to change. When Shigo said you don't have to paint cuts, the older guys wanted to dip him in tree paint and feather him up and haul him out of town, because they've been painting cuts for so long that it was blasphemy to say that you didn't have to paint.
Yeah. And then there was the younger generation, like saying couldn't wait to stop carrying around buckets of tar.
Oh, well, when Shigo told us, he came to California in 1976, he said, you don't have to paint. And I went back to my dad, who had been behind painting his entire career to that point, was coming up on 50 years. And the California Arborists Association standard, and I quote, was all cuts that cannot be covered with a silver dollar. That was in the standard. A silver dollar had to be painted. And that's what we had stuck to. But I told him, I said, this guy Shigo says we don't have to paint. I said, what do you think? And he says, I've always known that it was better to make a good cut than it was to paint a bad one. He said, if you can sell the clients on it, I don't have an objection. Now, that's pretty darn progressive for a guy that was in his 70s and had been painting all his life. And he was rare. But first few clients, I said, would you be willing to participate in a scientific experiment? We're working with this fellow, Alex Shigo, who is studying the compartmentalization of decay in trees. And he's been proving this theory that we don't have to paint cuts. You're used to us painting cuts. Would you object to us not painting this time around? Nobody ever objected. They said, look, you're the expert. You do what's right. So I saved so many jeans at that point.
Excellent.
If you want to, I've enjoyed this immensely, and I'd be more than happy to visit with you at any time. I want to leave you with a quote that. Now, there's a very famous, popular Irish toast. It says, may you dance as if no one's watching, sing as if no one's listening, and live every day as if it's your last. And I'll drink to that. But I would rather say, may you work safely, even when no one is watching, and live every day so that it won't be your last.
Amen.
Yeah, man, that's a good one.
Yeah, work as if no one is watching. May you work as that's
I'll
good.
send that to you.
That's a good modification. Well, I want to thank you, Don, and our collective knowledge you know, you represent, you double Tony and I in that together, I think. And there's more we can talk about, and I certainly would relish another opportunity to just carry on and continue the discussion. So we'll be in touch for sure, and I look forward to our next visit.
Got it.
Absolutely, you got a deal. And I was honored when you called me and said that in talking to Norm Hall and other people, my name kept coming up as one of their earliest inspirations. I was honored by that.